All right, Assalamualaikum and very good day. Welcome to yet another session of ours, and this time it is on the development of alternative assessment tasks. Belum apa-apa dah tersasul kan. If you are not related to this course, but you are here because you're interested with the content of this particular video, please be informed that this particular video or content is very much related to one of the assessments in the course of assessment literacy and performance competencies. Panjang note namanya. And the assessment concerns the development of alternative assessment. Right, before we continue, several things which I would like to relay. Number one, saya tak sihat, saya demam. Wahai studentku. Batuk-batuk. So, I might be coughing at some point of this video. Itu yang pertama. Secondly is that my internet connection is not that excellent. So it might also disrupt the smooth running of this video. Sat lagi mulut saya bercakap lain tapi suara keluar lain, dia macam lagging-lagging. Bertabah lah ya. And the third one is that this is going to be a long macam tu. And dry video. So, do employ strategies that will sustain your motivation. Maybe take a break in between. It is a YouTube video anyway. You can pause and play whenever you want. And also, keep hydrated because water is important. Tiba. Baik. Without further ado, let's begin. There are two parts to this video. The first one concerns the step-by-step process of the development of alternative assessment tasks. And the second video, part two, will cover information with regard to major considerations that you must exercise in the development of alternative assessment. Please be informed that we are going to jump right into the step-by-step process. I am not going to explain about what alternative assessment is or what are the different types of alternative assessment that we have. That is covered in the class. Baiklah, to make your life miserable, saya tengah tengok ni sebab tu mata saya ke bawah. To make your life miserable, if it is not miserable enough already, there are 14 steps in the development of alternative assessment. And these are the steps that you must follow in light of implementing and designing your alternative assessment. Okay, so we are going to go through each one of these steps. Some of them will entail detailed explanation, but some of them will just be mentioned in passing. Anyhow, it will be a long video nevertheless. Baik, mulakan dengan step yang pertama. Alright. So planning is very important. Kata nak mulakan dengan step yang pertama tapi tiba-tiba cakap planning je. Okay, planning. When we do assessment, planning is extremely important. And you must dedicate some time in your busy life as a teacher to plan for your assessment. Okay, and in the development of any assessment, the more details that you give to your assessment, the more details and considerations that you have, the better is the outcome of your assessment. And good planning is an essence to highly valid and highly reliable assessment. It doesn't matter whether it is traditional assessment or alternative assessment, planning is a must. Baik, kita teruskan. Alright, we will be looking at constructive alignment in the upcoming weeks in the class. Constructive alignment is the gist to any highly valid and reliable assessment. And constructive alignment consists of three main components. Apa constructive alignment yang nanti kita cover ya. But basically, in the selections of the learning standards, in the first step of this alternative assessment development, you must make sure that you have the objective of your assessment, right? And these objective must align with your assessment type, and they also must align with the scoring. These are the major components. We will delve into this later, but I must mention about constructive alignment as the most important considerations before we even delve into any of the steps. Baik, teruskan. I'm making your life more miserable by confusing you guys kan. Tak apa, nanti kita akan talk more about constructive alignment. The first step to the development of alternative assessment is the selection of learning standards. Okay, and as teachers, where do we get these learning standards from? There are two main documents. The first one is the DSKP, Document Standard Curriculum dan Pentaksiran, and the second document is the Rancangan Pengajaran Harian, the Rancangan Pengajaran Harian, yeah, RPH, or Compilation of Teachers' Lesson Plan. In essence, I've mentioned this so many times in class. In essence, assessment comes after teaching. We teach first and then we assess. And when we teach, our teaching is guided by our lesson plan. And the lesson plan will have objective pembelajaran which serve as the heartbeat of the lesson. All right. This objective pembelajaran serves as the content and the learning that we want students to be able to master. Okay, and when the time comes for our assessment, we look back at our lesson plan, specifically this objective pembelajaran. Okay, it also helpful to look at the DSKP so that we understand which part of the DSKP that these objective pembelajaran or learning standards are taken from. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that when we want to do assessment, assessment must be rooted to our teaching, and we assess the things that we have taught, and the information can be obtained from our rancangan pengajaran harian. Okay, so that is the first step. The first step, the selections of your learning standards. After you have selected your learning standards, you must have high clarity of what the learning standards entail. What exactly the learning standards requires to the teachers to do in order to teach, and then what is the kind of learning that students need to demonstrate in order for that to be able to give you certain kind of clarity. You must understand how the learning standards is formulated or stated. Marilah kita melihat kepada learning standard. Allah kecil no katanya, yeah, tak besarkan. Okay, so this is the landscape, rupa bentuk muka bumi of how a learning standards look like in the DSKP. In the content section, our DSKP is segmented into three main columns. We have standard kandungan, the main topic, standard pembelajaran, the learning standards which I have been mentioning time and time tadi, as well as catatan. Okay, when we want to do our assessment, traditional or alternative assessment, whatever assessments it is, make sure that kita hadamkan betul-betul what exactly the kind of information trying to be conveyed by these content standards and learning standard. Okay, so say for example, we are selecting this learning standard as a basis of our assessment. Menerangkan isu sosio-saintifik dalam sektor pengurusan sisa dan air sisa. And this is taken from Science Form 4. Okay. When we deciding, tiba-tiba tak tahu nak cakap apa kan. When we are deciding on our assessment, please have a look at the catatan in the DSKP, because sometimes recommended assessment will also be presented here in this section. For example, mengumpul maklumat dan membuat persembahan multimedia mengenai this aspect. So, this is the learning standards covering this particular topic. This is the recommended assessment, persembahan multimedia, and within that pembentangan multimedia, okay, this is the content that must be covered. Alhamdulillah dah. Okay. So, let's look at this. Menerangkan isu sosio-saintifik. So, this is covered here. Dalam sektor pengurusan sisa dan air sisa, there are two type of information that must be presented by the students in this assessment. So, have a look at this. we do understand that we are required to do persembahan multimedia, but apart from persembahan multimedia, as a teacher, you can also choose other forms of assessment or other type of assessment. But if you want to choose other than what is recommended in the catatan, make sure the one that you have chosen is comparable with the one recommended here. So, if the recommended assessment is persembahan multimedia dan awak tak nak buat persembahan multimedia for various reasons. Maybe, for example, you are giving 4 assessments to your students which involve pembentangan. So you want to diversify in that one particular year of teaching and learning period. You don't want all of your pembentangan to focus on multimedia. Maybe you can have one multimedia presentation. The other one is could be mini forum. The third one is demonstration, and the fourth one is mini podcast, for example. So it is always good to diverse the kind of assessments that you have, so that it will invite different type of responses or evidence of learning. All right. So I've mentioned a number just now, mini podcast or podcast. What else did I mention? Dah terlupa dah. Goldfish memory katanya kan. Mini forum. You can also go with a vlog post, for example. So whatever assessment that you are choosing, if it is not multimedia, must be comparable because the focus is on explanation, okay, and presentation. So you must comply with the same range of this assessment recommended here. I think I've been spending too much time on this one. So mari kita kembali. So what I'm saying is that after you have selected your learning standard, bacalah learning standard itu dan fahamkan apa yang diharapkan daripada learning standard tersebut. Because the assessment that we are choosing is supposed to comprehensively capture that standards ataupun the learning intended by the standards. Okay, let's look at a couple more learning standards just to get some idea. Okay, some learning standards are quite specific in terms of the assessment expected. For example, biology form 4 here, mereka bentuk eksperimen untuk menyelesaikan masalah bla 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 bla. So the intended assessment must be experiment, and you do not have the luxury of choosing other form of assessment. But most learning standards are quite general in terms of assessment that you can choose from. If that is the case, then you can choose assessment that of your choosing, but make sure that they still cover the learning intended here. Okay, just to let you know that the DSKP consists of a list of learning standards. Let's look at this one. Sekejap. No, I'm struggling. Okay. Um, Most of the DSKPs, the learning standards are mixed together in terms of the assessment that can be appropriately conducted. Because the main point of the DSKP's arrangement is to arrangement the learning standards according to the level of complexity, from the easiest to the most complex. Okay, but within this, you need to be able to decide which learning standards are suitable for traditional assessment, such as test and examination or old-fashioned written assignment, and which learning standards are suitable for alternative assessment. Okay, and also the fact that when they are arranged according to the levels of complexity, the verb here will indicate, the verb ialah kata kerja, dan kata kerja ialah tugasan yang perlu pelajar lengkapkan ataupun demonstrasikan, dan kata kerja ini align with the cognitive complexity as per on Bloom's taxonomy cognitive domain. Okay, so menyatakan ialah level 1 pada Bloom taxonomy. Remember, um, menganalisa ialah level 4 pada Bloom taxonomy, analyzing. Menjana idea ialah pada aras 6 Bloom taxonomy, create. Okay, so why are we babbling about this? You are not babbling, I am yapping. Okay, it's the fact that be mindful of the verb here and be informed of what level does the verb represent? Because that is the targeted level of the complexity of the assessment that you are developing. Okay, for example, menjana idea bagaimana proses sosial boleh mempengaruhi identiti dan sebagainya. So, the assessment that you are developing to capture this learning standard must provide students with a platform for them to showcase the ideas that they have generated. Okay, and also knowing that the level is 6 will also be helpful later when we are designing and developing the rubric to assess this particular assessment. All right, so I'm just going to stop here with regard to learning standards. But of all the DSKPs that we have for all the subjects, I do find the DSKP for pendidikan seni visual quite easy for the teachers, art teachers to navigate, because the learning standards for pendidikan seni visual PSV have been cakap tak betul dah, have been systematically arranged according to the assessment type and focus. So all the SKPs for PSV across Form 1 to Form 5 are segmented into 4 sections. And the first section, okay, katakanlah 2.4. So 2.41 ialah the learning standards are suitable for traditional assessment, test and exam. And then the second segment in the same content will be focusing on research workbook or folio. The third segment is for production, artwork production or art production. If it's mencatan, so pelajar perlu mencatan. If it's sculpture, pelajar perlu menghasilkan sculpture. And finally, the fourth segment, okay, and this information is pretty detailed because I do have art students watching this video as well. And the fourth segment is for exhibition and presentations, as well as penggunaan bahasa visual, seni visual. Okay, so it's quite clear cut and it's very much assistive to the art teachers. But for the other subjects, learning standards are all mixed together. So teachers need to have the competency to decide which one is for traditional assessment and which one is for alternative assessment. Okay. Just a reminder, as I said, this is going to be a very long video kan. Barulah step ketiga keempat ni ha. As a reminder, sebagai cikgu, we do have to focus on a lot of things. We need to teach, we need to assess, and we need to use the assessment to inform teaching and whatnot. And of course, we have a plethora of assessment tasks in one teaching and learning period. So, learning standards yang sesuai untuk traditional assessment, we will include those standards in test and exam. Dan konten yang telah di-cover dalam test dengan exam, we do not want to use those learning standards for alternative assessment. Maksudnya, learning standards yang untuk test dengan exam, jangan gunakan untuk alternative assessment. Because kita dah tanya dalam test dengan exam and it's the easiest form of assessment. Lebih mudah. Dengan 2 jam exam for example, kita boleh tanya macam-macam and covering a lot of learning standards. The ones that we want to choose for alternative assessment must be learning standards yang complex demonstration of learningnya, yang menjawab dalam test tidak cukup untuk demonstrate learning ini. Itu yang pertama. Okay. Yang kedua, when you look at the learning standards, if the learning can be demonstrated by the students within one period of class, then perhaps it is not for alternative assessment. In order for us to create assignment based on this learning standard, that particular assignment or that particular learning must require students to put in effort at least 3 to 4 hours or maybe few days or maybe few weeks to complete the assessment. Itu baru berbaloi untuk kita jadikan alternative assessment dan kita beri markah. Alright, kata dah habis learning standard tapi still on learning standards kan? Okay, teruskan. So after you have decided on your learning standards, you have understood what your learning standards require in the kind of learning that students need to demonstrate, and you have chosen your alternative assessment task. And when you choose your alternative assessment task, go crazy. but still be within the valid and reliable punya ruang lingkup or scope. Alright, but you want to go as authentic as possible. Okay, bukan semua learning standards dalam the SKP perlukan authentic assessment. There are some learning standards in the DSKP that are suitable for informal assessment, classroom activities without scores. There are also some learning standards that is appropriate only for traditional assessment. Ada untuk written assignment yang tak ada real world relevance. So they are not authentic assessment. But when we select learning standards and when you have the luxury to choose any form of assessment that you want that are appropriate, for example, so keep it as one requirements that you want to make it as authentic as possible. Okay, so what exactly is authentic assessment? Authentic assessments are assessment that have high real world relevance. These are the kind of tasks that students will have to engage in when they join the workforce later. For example, you, my students, are pre-service teachers and you will become teachers, inshallah. And the kind of assessment that you are doing now are authentic assessment if they are also the tasks that you will be performing once you are a teacher later. For example, you will be teaching later, of course, as part of parcel of your profession. So we have micro teaching assessment in this teacher training program. So nak batuk sebenarnya. Okay, so micro teaching is an authentic assessment. There is also a course known as meetings, which students learn how to carry out meeting, write memos, write minutes of meetings. So these are authentic assessment because when you work later, you also have to carry out meetings, write memos, and write minutes of meetings. Okay, presentations, um, report, case study, field work, research proposal. So all these are authentic assessment. Decide on the timeline. So ini ialah langkah kelima Okay. Tadi cerita pasal go authentic, select authentic assessment if possible. Whatever is the selection of your assessment, dia mesti memenuhi learning standards. Itu yang paling penting. Okay. Decide on the timeline. Think about how long would you require to plan, execute, and implement the assessment, and how long would your students require to complete the assessment and to submit, for example. Okay, fikirkan. And when you are thinking of this timeline, think also the kind of support. For example, some assessment might require students to do consultation. They need to consult you and show progress, for example. And you might also need to consult your students in respect to looking at whether are they working on it, how the progress is going. For example, sometimes some assessment would require students to confirm the topic with you and get your approval before they proceed. So all these come into the timeline. Okay, so the best way to demonstrate your considerations on the timeline for assignment one is perhaps to come up with, literally speaking, the timeline. You might want to have like this garis yang shows garis masa, for example. The assessment will take 3 weeks. So you have week 1, week 2, week 3. And week 1 is how you communicate the assessment to the student. Week 2, students confirm the topic and you approve on certain thing, and week 3 is the actual presentation, for example. So you might want to demonstrate that and illustrate that in the submission of your assignment one. Okay. Please be informed that in schools, teachers do not have the same luxury as we are in university. Kalau dekat university, I throw in the assignment to you during the first day of the semester, but the submission is on the week 14. So you have 14 weeks to work on the assignment. But in school, teachers do not have that luxury. Teachers will need to cover a lot of topics. Okay, and the timeline for the duration of the assessment must also be in keeping with that topic. Say for example, usually tak lama 2 ke 3 minggu sahaja. 2 minggu, for example, if it's presentation, maybe 2 weeks from the point of you giving the assignment to the point that students have to deliver the presentation, and all the Nikki, whatever things that happen in between is within that 2 weeks. Okay, teachers do not have the luxury of delaying the assessment, because say for example cikgu bagi assessment itu 3 minggu untuk student prepare and also do the presentation for example, tapi pada time masuk minggu ketiga cikgu dah move on dengan tajuk lain, and then student baru nak present, so that particular topic loses relevance. Okay, sebab tu dekat sekolah kena cepat. That being said, there are some assessment that will take time. For example, capstone project. Okay, uh, or for example, project that requires to do field work, collect data, develop questionnaire. For example, um, portfolio assessment, also one that is time consuming. Portfolio is a compilation of work. For example, English teacher or Bahasa Melayu teacher, they are covering 4 different types of essays for that year, daripada argumentative essay, topical, narrative, kepada apa lagi satu, cause and consequences katakanlah. So the portfolio assessment will compile all those essays written, all the students' work. So lama lah. If that is the nature of the assessment, then it's okay. Alright, so look at your assessment. Also look at the kind of topics that teachers cover based on the textbook. There are plenty of online textbooks these days available, and decide on the best timeline to go about and execute the assessment. Alright, so we are on the 5th step. The 6th step, lepas dah decide timeline, boleh je decide ni dulu ke yang timeline tadi ke, tak kisah. Deciding whether the assessment should be individual assessment or group assessment. Now, what are the considerations? Kita main tibai sajakah ataupun memang ada considerationsnya? Of course, memang ada considerationsnya. Okay, what is the most important factor that gets us to decide which one should we go with? The first and foremost, content complexity. Okay, look at the content. If the content is too much, maybe group setting will be better. Okay, how do we decide whether the content is too much and what not? If it is a written submission, just imagine, can one person handle that kind of content to submit? If several people working together, uh, is a much better fit than have group assessment. So number one is content complexity. The second one is the nature of the assessment. If it is presentation, okay, then you might also want to go with group presentation. If it is informative speech, persuasive speech, so the setting is of course individual. If it is debate, for example, takkan nak debate seorang-seorang, macam pelik. So it should be two opposing teams. So the nature of the assessment will also be helpful in deciding which setting or which format should you go, whether individual or group assessment. Okay. The third consideration is, of course, on a more practical side, the total number of students that you have, your own capacity as a teacher to handle the assessment. Say, for example, you want to do individual presentation. Um, I've been scratching my nose sebab tengah sesama, stress gila. If you are teaching large number of students and you can't afford to do individual assessment, you'll be overwhelmed. So practical considerations, of course, kicks in. Then just have group assessment. Okay, whatever it is, write on the three considerations which I have just mentioned. Okay, decide on support and scaffolding strategies. This is the kind of guidance or assistance that you can provide to the students in the course of them doing the assessment. But all this must come when you are planning for the assessment. Semua ni kita dah tengah buat masa planning, kita dah fikir awal-awal. So, are students venturing into a new assessment format that they are not really familiar? If, for example, students are doing case study, okay, I have no qualm if you want to introduce case study to your students secondary school, tapi mengikut aras, laras dan kompleksiti yang sesuai untuk pelajar tersebut lah. Maybe you give them a set of data, for example, but the context in which the data is residing must be something of interest to the student. Okay, um, For example, just now I had a class with my TESOL students, and one of the learning standards is looking at in getting students to investigate and analyze national issues. Then I tanya, what kind of national issues that you have in mind? And then my students said, maybe cryptocurrency, marijuana, gitu. I was like, okay. So remember that, of course, there's a lot of national issues, but you are introducing national issues to secondary school students. As much as you want them to be challenged by the task, think also about students' interest and also their level. Find something that is relevant to them. For example, maybe focus on boycott, divestment, sanction, BDS, for example, um, underage marriage. So you want something that is tackling their interest, but also tapping into the current relevance. Okay, and think of the support. Do you need to provide them with consultation? Do they need to consult you just to get their concerns and uncertainties clarified? Do they need your approval on certain thing? Okay, for example, if you are having group assessment for presentation, will you be giving presentation title for each group to present? Okay. When you give them presentation title, will all the groups get the same title or each group gets different title? So these are also considerations. All right. And if you don't want to give them titles, will you give them themes? And then they decide what title do they want to venture in based on the theme. For example, for informative speech, the theme is natural disaster. Okay. So there might be one person talking about flood in Shah Alam, for example, or maybe monsoon rained in Kelantan. So they will pick their own topics based on the theme that you have given. My English is Laut Cina Selatan. So they will be picking their own title based on the theme that you have given. Alright. But sebagai cikgu, you need to decide and approve first about this title. They must see you for consultations and you approve their title before they proceed, because you don't want to them to engage in title yang ada low learning relevance, for example. So this title must be significant and worthwhile and academic as well. Alright. So marilah kita teruskan. The next consideration is to decide whether students should submit written assignment, for example, or do they need to present. Some learning standards are very clear. For example, students need to present multimedia presentation, so it's presenting. But some learning standards are quite general in terms of the assessment that you can choose from, which you are spoiled with choices. Boleh submit written assignment, boleh juga present. So nak pilih mana satu. Okay, of course there are writing considerations. Um, think of which medium, some of the written assignment, or and presentation, which one will better demonstrate the intended learning. Okay, say for example, students have to do a mathematic task. Okay, you've given your students three or four mathematical problems, and you really want them to be able to demonstrate jalan kerja. Okay, if that's the case, and demonstrating jalan kerja ini, you want to see their thought processes. So maybe presentation is better because they can verbally explain the jalan kerja, and you can also use that opportunity to ask them while they are presenting to clarify certain aspect dan sebagainya. But if, for example, you are only interested with the outcome, so maybe just submit written assignment without presentation. Okay, so the most important consideration is the fact that yang mana satu paling sesuai untuk pelajar hasilkan, yang boleh demonstrate the best form of the mastery of learning intended. Okay, so under what condition should students be allowed to present in class if it's presentation, and under what condition should they be allowed to submit just recorded presentation? Right. Of course, masa pandemik, pelajar semua submit recorded presentation or the presentation is carried out online. So we can safely assume that to do a recorded presentation is not something that is too highly technical for our students. Okay. But to get them to present physically in class or to submit recorded presentation will be dependent on a number of things. Yang paling-paling penting ialah, okay, remember the washback effect? Apakah? The fact that assessment can also promote learning. Okay, if you are giving different presentation title to different groups, and when each group is presenting, the other groups will also learn something. Then physical presentation would be the best format for that particular assessment. Okay. However, if all the groups are given the same presentation title, and you are teaching content based subjects, for example, history, for example, semua orang dapat title yang sama. And when they are presenting, you can expect the fact that all of the groups will be presenting the same content. In that case, then maybe recorded presentation is a much better option. Okay, sebab kalau tidak nanti semua grup bosan and there will be no meaningful interaction sebab semua orang present benda yang sama, semua orang tahu dah benda itu. Okay, so that is the considerations. However, even if you give one particular topic, for example, semua orang dapat topik yang sama, but you are sure when students are presenting, there will be different quality and different focus of presentation, then by all means have a physical presentation in class. Okay, that being said, there's also other consideration at place, particularly students demographic. If you are teaching in an urban area where students do not have time to meet because right after school they will have to go to work, they are jam packed with a lot of extracurricular activities, and when you get them to do recorded presentation, for example for group assessment, they won't have the time to meet with the other classmates and record and whatnot. Then there is no other option. You still have to get them to present in class. Similarly, if you are teaching in a very rural area, for example, where technical competency is a challenge, nak record requires the use of digital device, internet connection dan sebagainya. If you feel that students may not have access to those, then you don't have any other options. You still have to go with face-to-face presentation. Okay, I think that's kind of lengthy explanations and also very descriptive. Cukup lah kot kan. Mari kita semak. Kah masih bernyawa? Masih. Okay, teruskan. Hang in there. Kita sekejap saja. Alright, more questions. When do we get students to submit the product? And when do we get students to do presentation as well? In other words, when do they need to do presentations, or when they just submit product without the presentation? Okay. Of course, that will be based on the components that you are assessing. If your grading is based on product, okay, and the process of coming up with the product is pretty much straightforward and not complex and not something that you're interested to know, then student just submit the product. Tak payah presentation. But if the process of coming up with the product itself is complex, and the process coming up with the product is also part of the learning access, in addition to the product itself, then students will come up with the product and do presentation at the same time. Okay, so dalam assessment we have this process based and product based assessment. Process based means you'll be giving mark based on the process. Okay, the process that students go through to come up with the task. And product based is when you give marks to the assessment based on the final outcome of the assessment. Okay, for example, research proposal. Maybe you will give marks based on the process, from the point of students consult you and whatnot, up to the point that the final research proposal is produced. So it will have both component, process and product. Katakanlah untuk sains, pelajar perlu menghasilkan satu produk daripada bahan terbuang, and you only want to measure the product, not the process. So that will be just product and just the submission of the product without presentation. Okay, I need to go on faster. I hope that you guys are still breathing. I know I am, but having this particular gear would be helpful to me for the time being. Macam menarik. Okay, teruskan. Uh, Step 9, decide on the scoring. Okay, determine. For example tadi deciding whether you want to give marks on the process or product or both, itu pun dalam consideration ini juga. Okay, um, the manner in which the scoring will take place will also be dependent on the type of assessment. For example, kalau presentation, then the scoring will be done when both you and the students are present in the same space, unless kalau student submit recorded presentation. Okay. Alright, I'll be sharing this particular PowerPoint later for you to refer to. Still within scoring punya realm, decide on the scoring tool as well. I know that most people will go with rubric, but rubric is not the only assessment tool out there. Rubric can get very complex, and even when you want to use rubric, you need to decide, do I want to use analytic rubric or holistic rubric? Okay, if the performance is formative, then the best rubric to use is analytic rubric. And if the task that you are giving is summative in nature, katakanlah final presentation, where feedback is no longer required because it is towards the end of the semester or teaching year, then holistic rubric would be sufficient. But whatever it is, decide on the best tool that you need to use. Okay. Finally, bukanlah finally tapi nombor 10 lah, dah tua-tua sehujung dah ni. Don't forget to figure out the manner in which you will be communicating about your assessment to students. Okay, we have planned everything, and now we need to decide how do we communicate about the assessment. Alright, communicating about the assessment pun perlu dijelmakan dalam timeline tadi. Alright, because you need to give, or you need to communicate the assessment to students just in the right time and within sufficient time for them to carry out the assessment. It is always good to give the assessment early and give students ample time to work on the assessment. Kalau dia nak buat last minute, itu student punya, itu up to him lah or up to her. But on the part of the teacher, on the part of the assessor, tanggungjawab kita sebagai cikgu is part of our accountability to make sure that the assessment given within the due time which enables students to complete it, to complete the assessment sufficiently in meeting the standards. Okay, so not only thinking about bila nak communicate the assessment, you also need to think of how would you communicate about the assessment to students. Okay, remember that documentation of assessment is very important. It is always best to come up with an assignment sheet ataupun information, assignment information when you are communicating about your assessment to students. If the information about the assessment is presented in the textbook, that is okay. Tapi kalau boleh, avoid just chalk and talk. Okay. Describing your assessment in the form of assignment sheet will be more systematic on the part of the teacher. It also sort of like enhances your professionalism as well as a teacher. At the same time, it provides students with uniform or standard document that all students can refer to. Okay, kalau kita main chalk and talk saja, student kena salin, kadang-kadang dia tak sempat sebab some students are slow writers. Nanti bila dia nak buat assignment, alamak, terkurang sikit assignment tu, not because they don't have the learning intended, tapi maklumat dia dapat tak cukup. Okay, so by having assignment sheet, producing the assignment sheet and photostat and give them copies, then we can make sure that all students are provided with the same information and they can refer to that when they are doing the assessment. Okay, teruskan. As I said, documentation is very important, particularly when you are dealing with assessment. So every single process, kalau boleh, documentkan. For example, when students need to confirm the title of their presentation. So maybe you want to come up with a Google Doc, for example, and then students go online and type down the title in this form. Okay, and then you have this form as a reference. When students present, you can double check, kenapa awak present tajuk lain, hari tu awak confirm dengan saya tajuk lain, tajuk awak ni tak betul pula dah, hari tu confirm dah okay. So at least you have something to work on. And it can also be serve as a useful document. Kod tiba-tiba ada auditor masuk kelas dan sebagainya. Okay, teruskan, and don't forget to check the students' progress from time to time. Kadang-kadang student pun lara juga, so kita kena ingatkan, dah buat ke belum, where are you now in terms of your progress in doing the assignment and what not. Okay, so I'm going to go back to these 14 steps because some of these of the later steps are not reflected in my slides. All right, so after you have communicated about your assessment to the students, then you carry out the assessment. Of course, it comes with its own considerations. And then after the assessment have been implemented, it's time to score your assessment. And remember that by using rubric or any form of documentations scoring tool, for example, use the information in the scoring tool, rubric, rating skill dan sebagainya, to provide feedback for improvement. Okay, and then the feedback should give students the opportunities to reflect and adjust their learning. It also serve as a reflective point for you and to adjust your teaching. Okay, so those are the 14 steps. I know that this is a lot. It can be overwhelming to novice teachers and of course to the pre-service teachers. But when you become teachers later, these steps will come naturally to you. But at this point, in the completion of your assignment one, please do abide by these steps and demonstrate and illustrate your considerations in the template of assignment one. Gitulah gitu. So let's move down to the final page. Misplaced enthusiasm kan, I seorang je selalu enthusiastic kan, students tak. And one last thing, this is the conclusion. So we have looked at the step-by-step process in the development of alternative assessment. There are 14 steps, but these steps ensure that your assessment is comprehensive, valid and reliable. Okay, we will look at constructive alignment in the week to come. And of course, quote of the day, if you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito, according to Dalai Lama. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I hope the content of this video is fruitful. Till then, see you when I see you. Take care because I care.